Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another webinar from the TUC. My name's Anna, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by three guests. We've got my colleague Shelly Asquith, our Health and Safety Officer. We've got Ian Hodson from the BFAWU, and we've got Sarah Lyons from the NEU. They'll be speaking shortly, but I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. As ever, we've got live captions on this webinar, so if you want to follow along with the captions, please press the green button that's at the bottom of the screen, and a new screen will open where you'll be able to see those. It's great to see so many of you introducing yourselves in the chat panel on the right-hand side. It's good to see where you're from and what union you're from, so please keep that up, but also use the chat panel to exchange any ideas or tips you might have about the subject. We will have some time for questions from you in the audience after we've heard from Shelly, Sarah and Ian. So do please post any questions you've got in the Ask a Question panel, which is right underneath us at the bottom. Just click that and a little panel opens up where you can type your question. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, but if we don't answer them all, please don't worry, because we use those questions to give out to inform what the guidance we give to reps on this subject will be. So today's subject, protecting workers from extreme temperatures in the workplace. Last week was pretty hot, as we all remember, and next week is set to be pretty hot. Today, it's kind of in the middle. So even though the subject may not be strictly relevant today, it will be for going forward, because we all know that the weather is a changeable thing. We are also today launching some new e-learning about extreme temperatures in the workplace, and you will be getting a sneak peek of it from Shelly when she speaks. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Shelly, who is going to talk to you about the TUC position on extreme temperatures. So Shelly, over to you.
Thanks, Anna, and hi everyone. It's great to be with you all again through the screen. I'm going to talk in general terms about the issue and some of what we can expect from employers before we go into more detail about what's been done in various workplaces and how you as activists and reps can organise around this issue to keep colleagues safe and ensure thermal comfort in your workplace. Excuse me. So working in extreme temperatures isn't new. It's been a concern on safety reps' radars for some time. And it's a bigger risk in certain jobs and in certain sectors. But as long as climate change and global warming brings with it hotter summers and heat waves are lasting twice as long as they did 50 years ago, that brings more risk. So this is a problem that is only going to worsen and begin to take effect amongst more groups of workers in more workplaces. Working in extreme temperatures is associated with a number of health hazards. So it really is a health and safety issue. You've got hazards such as heat exhaustion, dehydration, sunburn and skin damage, skin cancer, and even death. In 2020, 2,500 people died in the heat waves in Britain. And on the other end of the spectrum, in cold weather, you've got the risk of frostbite and hypothermia. And workers who are asked to work in extreme temperatures should inform their employer of any new or existing health conditions where it could be even more additional risk. For example, if you've got heart disease, thyroid conditions, diabetes, skin cancer, or pregnancy. And also menopausal workers will experience high working temperatures more adversely, and there should be steps put in place to support them. Many employer menopause policies look at things like ventilation, use of fans, for example. But these are all kind of conditions which could cause serious problems for the individual if put in prolonged heat or sun exposure or cold temperatures. What are employers' responsibilities to mitigate against that? Well, temperatures in the workplace are covered by the Workplace Regulations 92, the Health and Safety and Welfare Regulations, which place a legal obligation on employers to provide a reasonable temperature in the workplace. Now, the law doesn't stipulate a minimum temperature in workplaces, but the regulations do suggest that the temperature in workrooms should normally be at least 16 degrees Celsius or 13 degrees Celsius if much of the work indoors is involving kind of severe physical effort, strenuous activity. The regulations do not, however, lay down a maximum temperature, but the TUC's position is that at 24 degrees Celsius, employers must begin to take action to reduce the temperature, and 30 degrees Celsius should indicate an absolute maximum working temperature, or indeed 27 degrees, again, if there's strenuous work activity taking place. Adequate and appropriate risk assessment procedures are absolutely essential. Employers are legally obliged to do that. And depending on the outcome of a risk assessment, appropriate personal protective equipment must be provided. So, for example, that might be warm clothing and gloves if you're working in cold temperatures, or sunscreen, access to water if it's hot. And also, health surveillance or medical screening might also be required for staff who've got special requirements, for example, those illnesses that I mentioned before. Additionally, employers are required to investigate any reports of illnesses that might be caused by working in hot or cold temperatures, and, if necessary, implement appropriate controls to manage those risks. And do in this instance recommend advice on working in heat and cold on the Health and Safety Executive's website, where they go into more detail of what's expected of employers. Appropriate facilities and rest breaks must also be provided in certain circumstances. So that would allow for workers to get water, cold water, or hot drinks, depending on the type of temperature we're talking about. Crucially, respite from sun. So especially if you're working outdoors at midday during those peak sun hours where UV rays are more dangerous. Regular breaks from cold temperatures should be factored in, and that might also involve job rotation. It might involve flexible work patterns so that people aren't working at the hottest times or the coldest times. And also, education and training should be provided to staff on environmental monitoring, recording, safe systems of work, health awareness, and what to do if you are at risk. Now, coming on to what unions can do. So you've heard about what employers have to do. There are really practical things that we can be doing as activists and reps. Safety reps have the right to carry out inspections, and you can use things like thermometers, really easy way of monitoring working temperature, and reporting it to management where it's not safe. You can get members together, discuss what the issues are, maybe launch a survey to demonstrate to management the scale of the problem, and you can deliver your demands. So, what is it that needs changing that's going to keep us cooler or warmer? Is the PPE that we're being provided satisfactory? Is the sunscreen strong enough? Are they providing water when they ought to be? Can changes be made to our shift patterns to avoid the most extreme temperatures or the peak sun exposure? This is also a really useful way of engaging members in the union to begin with. Whether the weather is too hot or too cold, it's something that all of us are going to be experiencing. So it's something employers can quite easily respond to with practical changes, and that really helps build confidence in your membership and can give you a springboard for more union organising capacity. But of course, employers don't always respond to these demands, and with some things that we might be demanding, like ventilation, that's potentially quite an expensive investment. Adjusting shifts and taking on more staff to cover more time lost means losing business at peak times. And we all know that there are many bosses out there who are more interested in profits than in the health and safety of their workforce. So there may be additional action to consider, and union branches all over Britain have escalated to all kinds of action on this issue, ranging from issuing union improvement notices to employers to using Section 44 of the Employment Rights Act to remove themselves from a workplace where it was dangerously hot or dangerously cold. Now, whatever you decide, know that you'll have the support of your union behind you. And I hope some useful information and training provided to you by your union and indeed by the TUC. And with that, I'd just like to take this opportunity to give you a quick sneak peek at our new learning tool that we're launching today, Too Hot, Too Cold. Now, I'm going to share my screen and show it to you. Here we go. Perhaps, Anna, you can indicate that it's worked or not. Yeah.
Yes, everyone can see it. And just just to say, everyone, we will post a link in the chat, so don't worry about that. And we will send the link out to everyone who has registered for the webinar, so you won't miss out. But please enjoy the sneak peek from Shelly now.
This is what we call micro learning tool. It's just a really simple, easy to use one-page website, which gives you an overview of the issue and the kinds of things you can be considering in terms of taking action, in terms of organising around, and also points you to different resources, places where you can find more information. So let's just have a little quick scroll through, because I'm hoping that you'll go away and have a look in more detail, but you've kind of got an overview here of what exactly we think the minimum and maximum working temperatures should be and why, what the existing law says, why it's insufficient rather, what the problems are in the context of climate change, who's most at risk. Now, I've talked about people with particular illnesses. You've also got workers in non-unionized workplaces, workers who are lower paid or working in already hot temperatures. We've also got a note here about pregnancy and the menopause. A little bit more information here about why it's important, and then getting on to what can you do. So the kind of activities, talking to the membership, raising it, doing things like inspections and monitoring of the workplace. Ventilation, we know from the pandemic, is a really important thing, but it's absolutely key on this issue as well. Getting a policy put in place with your employer, a heatwave plan when it's too hot, and then we've got some information here about negotiation. And then just finally, some examples of what reps in different workplaces have done. A note here about some activity of PCS reps using CO2 monitors, redesigning the workplace. So on particularly hot days, it could mean that you move your desk, for example, away from a window where there's a lot of heat coming through, or indeed if it's cold. I'm hoping Sarah will talk a little bit about the activity of the NEU using thermometers, because I think that's a really, really effective action that they encourage. And then finally here, some reps who use Section 44 and shut down their workplace effectively because of the unsafe heat. So we will share that link and we'll email it around to everybody as well. But what I'm really keen to know is your thoughts and feedback, because it's brand new. And if you kind of feel free to share that with your members and get their thoughts on it as well. That's it from me. I'm looking forward to hearing people's questions and hearing from Ian and Sarah as well. And remember, unions make you cool. Thanks, Anna.
They absolutely do make you cool. Thanks for that, Shelley. And we will come back to you shortly for some of the questions that are being posted. But before that, we're going to hear from Ian Hodson from the BFAWU. And he's going to be talking to us about some of the work he's been doing with his workplaces to work against extreme temperatures. So, Ian, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Shelley and the TUC for inviting me along today. From where we sit, we go to work to earn a living, but for decades, the attacks on our health and safety by successive governments have meant for far too many, rather than improving lives, it's ended them, which is why raising health and safety at work is an essential part of the roles we play as trade unionists. For me, it's as important as any term and condition review. Nobody wants to be in that workplace that sees friends or colleagues losing their life or suffering due to their work, which is why organising around health and safety is important, and regular discussions with members is essential. It's a key issue for them and their families and leads to safer workplace. But it also leads to a stronger workplace too. Inquiring about people's welfare helps us build a profile of the workplace. It's information that enables us to build solidarity. It gives us information that we can use with employers to improve our workplaces. Being armed with facts of how workers are being impacted, it shows them that they have the ability to have their voices heard by being part of an organised workforce. It also means that often typical management responses of "this is the way it is," or "if you don't like it, you can leave" approach can be challenged too. Challenge makes managers better, even if they don't recognise it at first. My experience has shown me that. Why it's not always easy to strike up a conversation on health and safety. When it comes to the weather, what's easier for us to talk about? As a union, we launched the Cool It campaign in 2009. It was supported by the TUC, and has appeared in the Labour manifestos in 2015, 2017 and 2019. Although the 2015 version was largely reliant on what business needs were rather than what the workers' needs were. What is the campaign calling for? Its aim is to bring into legislation for an absolute maximum workplace temperature of 27 degrees for non-strenuous work and 30 degrees for strenuous work, 27 degrees for strenuous work. The aim is to make it normal to work. The aim is not to make it normal to work in such temperatures. We believe sustained heat for long periods of time is not good for your health. Why is it important to deal with heat in the workplace? The health risks of heat examples, and this is an example from the workplace that I used to work at in Blackpool before I was a trade union representative, where I worked on what was a caramel plant. And there was a guy that used to be on the buses who'd recently been made redundant. He'd been in the factory for a fortnight and he got placed on and works alongside me. Now, on the caramel plant, we was using a boiler. The heat and the temperature was very, very hot. He wasn't used to such conditions. He was like mid-40s, and trying to keep up had caused him to overheat. He became very, very faint. He went to the toilet and he collapsed, and later he died of a heart attack. Obviously, we asked the question about whether or not it had been impacted because of the heat, but the health and safety executive who investigated suggested that there is no connection between heat and his heart attack, but we believe there was quite clearly a link because that man had worked for many years in his previous role and not suffered from such ill health, but having worked in those hot conditions, he found that it was too much for him, and his heart caused him to die, which is one of the problems I believe that happens if you work in a workplace where temperatures are not controlled. And to me, this is why it was very important that our trade union launched the campaign about reducing temperatures in the workplace. On that particular day, we were working in temperatures of between 40 and 48 degrees. We believe the health and safety executive should include temperature readings in the recordings of accidents and incidents in the workplace. If you ask the HSE about the impact of environment on the incident, it's normally not considered, yet we all know the risks that are involved with heat. We believe as a minimum we should now be including temperatures in any accident or incident investigation. This will provide valuable information on the impact of heat in the workplace. And I know the headlines when Labour announced the plans in 2017 said McDonald to shut down business in hot weather, which was totally untrue. Would this mean stopping the job because we brought in legislation to keep our workplaces cooler? Well, only if it's unsafe to do so. And sometimes that's necessary when employers fail to protect us, but that wouldn't be an issue if the law was there to protect us. They would know exactly what was required of them. The reality is it's about good modern management. Let's call it modernisation of archaic working practices. It's like any other risk. It's about the need for employers to put in measures to reduce risk. It means better planning of when certain types of work should be done. For example, doing more strenuous work at times when the heat is not as high. Managers often like to tell us how they have a right to manage. Well, I agree. They just don't have a right to manage badly. They need to ensure work can be done when there is less risk. To use that and to manage time more productively, not for maximum profit, but for ensuring it's done safely and to protect our health. In our industry, we are expected to wear certain types of clothing, so the type of fabric needs to be lightweight, although in the winter it may need to be changed. But you would be amazed how little attention is paid to the need to supply comfortable personal protective equipment. Some of this is down to the people we supply, who expect workers to be dressed in clothing, and they don't understand that actually the hairs on your arms aren't likely to fall out, and you can wear short-sleeved overalls. But their understanding is normally not required of the jobs that we do, just of the measures that we're expected to meet their compliance, which is why we believe that if there was legislation in place, then of course their auditors would be forced to understand and take heed of workplace temperatures and the conditions that workers in manufacturing are expected to perform their tasks. Obviously, breaks should be increased in higher temperatures, and fresh drinking water readily available. Through our campaign, many employers will now also provide free refreshments and ice pops and ice lollies and ice creams in some circumstances, but we're seeking consistency here, and measures required would mean a minimum standard for all workers. In our factories, we can't just leave doors and windows open, so there is a requirement to fit with fly screens. Many factories had lots of glass. This has proven to make heat a real issue in the workplace. So measures to shade out the glass, which may include shutters, blinds, reflective screening, or in some cases painting them out, would also be identified and risk assessed for the impact on people, not just product. It's an energy efficient measure too. The introduction of legislation would be accompanied by a requirement for employers to train staff and management about the risks of heat and how to identify any signs of risks. Some basics that we need to do now. It should be, and we encourage all of our health and safety reps to place this on the Health and Safety Committee. We ask them to prepare in the winter for summer and in the summer for winter. I also would, ask and encourage our reps to place the introduction of a heat stress policy on the table. And I was interested to see the suggestion that Shelley's just briefly give us a look at about how that can be done. Thermometers should be placed throughout the workplace. It's surprising how many workplaces don't have them, yet there is a requirement to do so. They should be monitored for both temperature and humidity. Colour dehydration charts could be placed in all the toilet that provides people with information about hydration. Heat stress awareness guides located on notice boards, and probably the most important thing is to educate people in recognising the symptoms. These are some of the basic measures that we believe can be done now, but we do believe legislation is required, which is why we intend to relaunch our Cool It campaign with an animation, hopefully that will be developed and released shortly, and we can really start campaigning on this issue collectively with all the trade union safety reps across the country. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ian, for that really interesting insight into the work that you've been doing at the BFAWU. And absolutely, we need legislation on this issue. But I think what was really helpful as well is your advice on what things safety reps can do now while we're working towards that. So before we take questions, and it's great to see so many coming in, we're just going to hand over now to Sarah from the NEU, who will be able to tell us about the work that the NEU have been doing in schools to work to work against extreme temperatures there. So Sarah, let's hear what you've been doing, please.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay, thank you to the TUC for organising this webinar, and thank you, Shelley, for inviting me to speak. So I'm the lead officer for Health, Safety and Environment at the NEU, and we represent around 450,000 education staff. And as Shelley said, we know that heat waves are becoming more common with more extreme weather associated with climate change. And I think what we're experiencing now is how climate issues and health and safety issues are overlapping for trade unions. And right now, well, not particularly on this day, it's heat that's uppermost in our members' concerns, but later in the year, it could be other climate related problems like storms, flooding, blizzards, etc., that all impact on our members' working conditions. And, for education unions like the NEU, it also impacts on how children can learn. Leaky, drafty, overheated buildings aren't conducive to learning. And, we know that school and college buildings need to be retrofitted, upgraded, future-proofed, however we want to put it, to help adapt to climate change. They need to be more resilient to heat and cold, and more energy more energy efficient, and that process is proceeding at pretty much a snail's pace, thanks to the lack of ambition on the part of the Department of Education as set out in its education climate strategy. But more immediately, schools and colleges need to be able to bring in measures to make working conditions more comfortable. And in some respects, those measures that will make the working temperature more comfortable will also help, for example, reduce the disruption from future waves of COVID. So I'm thinking here about good ventilation, which in turn will provide a better environment for children to concentrate. So that ticks another box, and I'll say more about ventilation shortly. And as Shelley and Ian have said, we do, of course, need a maximum legal working temperature. Education staff and children can't work effectively in very high temperatures. But it seems there's no prospect of the current government bringing one in. So I suppose we have to be realistic about that, at least in the short term. As Shelley said, there are some legal protections, for example, in the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Workplace Health, Safety and Welfare Regs, which specify that temperatures should be reasonable, and also specify that thermometers should be made available to allow temperatures to be monitored. But notwithstanding that, even if there was a legal maximum, we would have to be able to enforce it, and we can't rely on the HSE. And it's the same with even the minimum legal protections that are in place. And as one of our exec members and local health and safety officers has rather succinctly put it, she said, "There's no one coming to save us, only ourselves." I think that's very true. But excessive heat in a school or college is an obvious area for collective action. It's likely to be widely and deeply felt by all staff members, as well as by the pupils. It's very unlikely to just affect one person. It may be that some classrooms get hotter than others, but very few people are going to be unaffected. And of course, remember that education staff, can't just leave a classroom even for a short period to get a cold drink, because they can't just leave the children. So we'd encourage this to be considered as a whole school issue like any other by the union group, and where possible involving members of other unions as well. And it's here, obviously, that, and I'm no doubt preaching to the converted, that health and safety reps have the rights that can make a difference. So we'd suggest organising a meeting with members to discuss the situation and what potential solutions could look like. Importantly, and Ian made this point, don't wait until the heat wave is upon us. Think about what happened last year, plan early for the next heat wave. I mean, maybe we should have been having this seminar in March, earlier in this year. So our approach would be, to have that meeting, meet with the head teacher, ask for a high temperature risk assessment. And Shelley mentioned the helpful HSE guidance, and it specifically says that if a significant number of employees are complaining about thermal discomfort, then the employer should carry out a risk assessment and act on the results. And I think aligning the issue with educational attainment is always going to be a good tactical move when talking to management, and also having the evidence to hand is really useful. And Shelley mentioned our NEU thermometers earlier, so I'll just give them a bit of a plug. So we sell them for 74p each from the online shop on our website. So we'd encourage health and safety reps to use those to monitor temperatures, whether too high or too low, and then you use that in negotiations with management. Shelley talked a bit about some of the mitigations that can be introduced. I'll just mention a few that could be introduced in a school, though many of them would apply across all workplaces, and some Some are longer term, but others could be brought in at shorter notice. So thinking of outdoor areas in schools, so trying to develop shady areas over time. So the planting of trees, which would be good for the environment as well, or construction of shelters. I mean, again, it's not something that can happen immediately. On a more immediate basis, short-term curtailing of certain heat generating activities, like turning lights off that don't need to be on, minimizing use of computers, Bunsen burners, ovens, all that kind of thing. Trying to avoid strenuous physical activity for PE lessons, easy access to drinking water for staff and pupils, and encouragement for pupils to drink water in classrooms. I mean, that should happen at all times of the year anyway, but obviously even more important in the hotter periods. Other things like reallocation of classes to cooler rooms whenever possible. That might not be possible. There might not be any, or it might not have any spare rooms, but if it is possible, it's an option. An easy one should be relaxation of dress codes for staff and pupils. Changes to the school lunch menu. I mean, that could be planned for, because there's no reason why you couldn't just have particular items on the menu in the summer anyway. That it wouldn't have to mean that the menus had to be changed at short notice. Another key point, ensuring that windows can be safely opened, and that was a point that we repeatedly made in our COVID safety checklist that we issued with the other education unions all throughout the pandemic. A lot of members were complaining that windows couldn't be open, so it's killing two birds with one stone. It's helping in relation to ventilation and COVID, and also in relation to heat. Also things like installation of blinds, use of air conditioning units in the worst affected classrooms, though caveat, they're noisy, they're not good for the environment, so we're not necessarily recommending them. Easier to obtain would be fans. Also, timetabling sports days for earlier in the summer term, if that's possible. And Shelley mentioned the needs of pregnant women who will feel the effects of heat more acutely than anyone else. And, for example, in a school might need to be excused from playground duty. They're more likely to suffer heat stroke, exhaustion and dehydration. And, similar for other people with other medical conditions, or as Shelley said, women going through the menopause, and you might need to have your request for changes in working arrangements supported by a doctor or a midwife. Finally, sort of starting or finishing school early if staff were happy with such arrangement, but you've got the issue of having to consult with parents, so that obviously makes it a bit more complicated. But I think many of those suggestions would be relevant beyond the education sector. And just going back to the issue of ventilation, I mean, the pandemic has taught us the benefits of ventilation in reducing the impact of COVID. And so boosting ventilation in schools and college buildings will also help reduce the spread of the other seasonal colds and flus that regularly make staff and people sick and keep them away from work or school. So it would be a win-win if you can kind of tackle those issues that result in educational disruption at the same time as high temperatures. And I'm sure those arguments would be relevant to other workplaces as well. And good ventilation, it can also help tackle indoor air pollution that can worsen asthma and trigger allergic reactions. We know a lot of children nowadays have allergies, and we know that indoor air can be contaminated in many ways, whether it's with asbestos, bacteria, viruses, microplastic particles, dust, mold, the list goes on. And we know studies have shown that above certain levels, carbon dioxide begins to impair cognitive function, and we all know how it feels to be stuck in a warm, stuffy room, particularly in the afternoon, around about this time, really. The headaches, the struggle to concentrate, the sleepiness, all that kind of thing. So, I mean, certainly for the NEU, whatever happens with COVID in the autumn and winter, we want to keep the focus on ventilation. You know, the pandemic's led to greater understanding of our indoor working conditions, and that what's helped in preventing the spread of COVID has wider benefits. So, you know, we don't want our members to forget about the CO2 monitors that were belatedly provided for schools earlier this year, and the HEPA filters, which are in place in some schools, although there aren't many of those, to be honest. So I suppose to sum up, just to say that I think all these areas are interlinked, you know, a safer climate, energy efficiency, saving money on your energy bills, and safer and healthier, more comfortable workplaces. So if we make progress on one, then hopefully we can make progress on them all. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for telling us about the work you're doing with the NEU in school, Sarah. I think there were so many good tips there that we could all take away, no matter what the workplace. And even though you're obviously talking about them in a school setting, they can apply to all types of workplaces, regardless of the sector. So we have had a lot of questions come in. I'm going to try and group them together because there's a lot about PPE or things that the employer should be supplying. So I'll try and group them. But actually, first of all, I'm going to go to a question that was emailed to me in advance. I'm not sure if the questioner is online, but hopefully they'll get to see the recording, but they sent it specially. So are there any rules about recording temperatures and keeping a record of temperatures? And if there are, what are they? And how could those records be used by reps to make a case, like perhaps the regularity or the frequency that they're making these measurements? So Shelley, can we perhaps go to you first with that, and then I'll come to you, Ian and Sarah, if you've got anything extra to add.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as far as I know, there's no rules about how frequently you can, you know, monitor the temperature in your workplace and record it and all the rest of it. I suppose you might want to be careful that it's not seen as interfering with the job that you're doing if you're, you know, every 5 minutes you're doing a temperature test. But I think there's absolutely no reason why you can't do that regularly. I know there was a question about the kind of questions you might want to be asking as a rep in regards to temperature. So making sure that you're monitoring the temperature in different parts of the workplace, at different times of the day, different points in the year, that would all be recommended. But in terms of any rules, I'm not aware of any. And I think keeping it in a sort of centralized system, and even maybe delegating the responsibility of recording temperatures to other members of your union committee or your branch, so that you're kind of sharing the workload, would be a good idea. But you want to keep it somewhere that you're able to then show it to management at the safety committee or wherever else and demonstrate the problem. But that's a good question, and it may be that Ian and Sarah know about some rules that I'm not aware of, but I don't think that there's any problems there.
Thanks, Shelley. Actually, Ian, I'm going to come to you next, because you mentioned about getting workplace temperatures on the agenda, and perhaps this is something that can be frequently on the agenda of that group. So just over to you on that issue.
Yeah, I mean, after we suffered a death, which we honestly believe was linked to heat, we started monitoring, and we had it on our health and safety committee. We reached an agreement with the management which recorded temperatures hourly. I mean, we also produced chocolate, so we regularly monitored the temperature in the workplace anyway for humidity around the product. So if it was good enough for the product, as far as we were concerned, it was good enough for us. And we just decided that if it was an hour for the product, it should be an hour for the people too. And that was quite important actually for addressing a lot of the issues around heat in our workplace. It's always pretty difficult if you're making caramel and you're working on a boiler, but it doesn't mean that you can't reduce the risk to people by putting measures in place, and obviously the humidity angle and the temperatures enabled us to put in place a policy there that enabled us to have extra breaks, to make sure that we had on hand drinking fountains, and also that we was able to bring in measures to keep the temperatures a bit cooler in the area too. And it also led to us changing the glass windows that used to be above where we used to do the boiling of caramel, which helps a lot as well, especially in the summer.
Thanks, Ian. And there are quite a lot of viewers today who have asked questions about kitchens or bakeries or hot workplaces. And so you're talking about chocolate and caramel production. I'm sure these same pieces of advice can be applied to places like kitchens and bakeries as well, where heat is an additional consideration. You've got heat all year round, obviously, but it's maybe more of an issue in the summer. Sarah, have you got any examples from schools of how frequently temperature readings have been taken?
Well, just going back to the original question, I don't think there's any particular rules or regulations about how often employers should monitor. But if you think that the temperatures are supposed to be reasonable, I mean, how can you ensure that they're reasonable unless you do monitor them? I suppose if you're thinking about a school situation, then the easiest times would be to monitor them would be first thing in the morning, perhaps at morning break, lunchtime and afternoon break, and close of play. And that would give you a picture over the day.
Thanks, Sarah. The next bunch of questions I'm going to approach are all about PPE or other protective measures. So we've had a whole bunch of these questions that include things about provision of PPE, or it might be sunscreen for some people who work outside. It might be about the type of overall, and Ian, you mentioned this, but basically the questions are saying that the employers will try and make an excuse about why they shouldn't provide that particular PPE. They might use allergies. So, for example, sunscreen, someone might be allergic to the SPF. It might be that you've got to wear this particular brand of high-vis jacket rather than one that might be a bit more breathable. So what advice can we offer and can reps take to management about these things and these areas of PPE, or something like sunscreen, which I suppose is a type of PPE. It's just not what normally comes into your head when you think of PPE. Shelley, can we go to you first, please?
Yeah, sure. I think the sunscreen one is really interesting because, like you say, it's not something you necessarily think of as being PPE. But I thought David's question in particular was really interesting about what employers are saying as their reasons for not providing it. And I think David is somebody who works outdoors in refuse, perhaps, and workers who regularly carry out their job roles outdoors are 3 times more likely to develop skin cancer. Employers don't legally have to provide sunscreen specifically, but they absolutely legally have to provide personal protective equipment. And I think you can absolutely argue that sunscreen is a form of personal protective equipment if it's protecting you from the risk of skin cancer known to be an occupational hazard in your particular job role. So they should be if they're not. And I think this idea that allergies is a reason not to is very silly. To put it lightly, you can easily ask workers if they've got any allergies and adapt your distribution on that basis. And I bet they provided hand sanitizer during the pandemic, without a worry about allergies that people had to the alcohol content or anything else. And how exactly is that different? They're both there to prevent a risk. So as I say, it's not a legal obligation, but it's absolutely best practice. And it's done on the understanding that this group of workers is at heightened exposure of particular risk, which you are. I would recommend getting the union to pursue that demand on the basis that sunscreen is PPE, or indeed whatever the PPE is that other people have identified as lacking in your workplace. Identify what the risk is, identify why that's preventative action to take. And if you're not getting anywhere with that demand, obviously speak to the union, but also see where you can get with registering that with the Health and Safety Executive.
Thanks, Shelley. And I think it is interesting, isn't it, that we could start regarding sunscreen as a type of PPE, even though it's not your traditional, solid physical barrier to something. It's still a barrier, albeit in lotion form. Ian, you mentioned a little bit about overalls in a hot environment, a manufacturing, a kitchen, a bakery, that kind of situation. Have you got any advice for getting better PPE there? Because obviously PPE is needed in that situation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the standard issue for reasons of comfort.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a massive issue in the baking industry in particular, but in any food manufacturing environment. And the argument's always been that we have to be, from neck to toe, protecting the food. So therefore, where there's a risk of hair falling out, etc., etc. And I always remember Ronnie Draper always used to, use this thing about pulling the hair on his arms and explaining to people that your hair doesn't fall out of your arms. It's very, very, very unlikely to happen unless you've done something to make it happen. But that argument has been very very strong, and now most of the employers that we work with, have listened to that advice, and we've demonstrated normally through using our health and safety committees that there is a need to review all of the overalls that we're expected to wear to make sure that they are comfortable. And using the PPE regs is the route that we would normally go down. And the justification that they normally use that obviously this is a compliance issue. We always trump with regulations. So I mean, for us, that's the starting point, and that's the finishing point, is to remind them of their duty to provide personal protective equipment, which is also comfortable for the wearer. Otherwise, we'll go and sit in the rest areas until they have done.
Thanks, Ian. I'm going to pose a different question to you, Sarah, because we've had a specific one about classrooms, but I think this could probably also be maybe applied to office spaces. The questioner talks about how their classroom gets particularly hot. Last week it was 26.5 degrees. Classrooms don't often have air conditioning, and they don't always have windows that open properly. And I think this example can be applied to other workplaces as well. They then also mentioned digital projectors, which are now common in workplaces, but I think we can also apply the idea of computers being common in other workplaces. And we know they pump out heat, especially if a lot of them are all on at once. Has the NEU got any activity around this, about campaigning around air conditioning in rooms that contain a digital projector or a bunch of computers?
We're not campaigning specifically for air conditioning, because I think that would kind of contradict our concerns in relation to climate change. I suppose we would look at it more along the lines that I suggested just now, in terms of, I know you can't have everything turned off all the time, but not leaving things on standby, possibly trying to take part in other activities during those hot periods which don't rely so much on those heat generating processes. Could I also say something quickly about sun cream?
Go for it.
Yeah, so just coming at the sun cream point from a different angle, I suppose in schools it's particularly an issue for children who are outside longer on hot days. And the issue that we've often come up against is the role of staff in relation to applying sun cream to the children. So, there might be an expectation that, on the part of parents that staff will apply sun cream to every child in the class several times a day. And obviously it's a workload issue, but it's also, worry in terms of kind of personal contact. Intimate contact, if you like, with children. So what we say in our guidance is, even from a young age, children can be, supported, supervised to apply it themselves. And of course, parents can apply it first thing in the morning, and that you can now get some creams that claim to, last the whole day anyway. So I just thought I'd mention that. That's
an excellent point, Sarah. It is obviously teachers have that additional contact with kids, so it is something that if you work in education with little ones, that you obviously have to think about. Okay, I've got a bunch of questions that I'm just going to fire quickly at you, Shelley. I'm really sorry, but you get the across all unions perspectives, so maybe you can help here. You mentioned about surveying your members. Do you know of a questionnaire which health and safety reps could use? Have we got a template or a sample that you might have seen in another union that we as the TUC can, make generic and send out? Or is there one we could put together?
There is a checklist in the Call It campaign guide that I linked to in the chat earlier that you can use to sort of inform a survey. But I did actually find something interesting that Usdaw has put up, which is a workplace temperature survey that is targeted at reps. But it does, I've just posted that in the chat as well, it does get you thinking about the kinds of things that you want to be checking for in the workplace, and you might want to adapt some of those questions as things you want to ask members as well. I just want to take this opportunity, Anna, because I know we've not got long left, to plug something. Now, we've been talking about how we get cooler or thermal comfort in our workplaces based on organising the activities that unions can take and demands we can put on employers. But we do ultimately also want the law to change on this. And I mentioned at the beginning how there is no legal maximum working temperature. The TUC is calling for one. We want it to be the absolute maximum is 30 degrees Celsius, but also for 24 degrees Celsius to be the trigger by which employers absolutely have to start taking action to cool the workplace. We've got a petition calling for that, and I'm going to share that in the chat, and I'm hoping that you will sign it and share it with your members as well, because the more names we can get behind that, the better. But as I say, we can't rely on the law alone. The biggest impact we can have is in our workplaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said earlier, while we are continuing to campaign for a change in the law, we can still continue to make these incremental changes workplace by workplace. Of course, it's not perfect, but we don't want to do nothing while we're waiting. Okay, we've had a batch of questions as well about drinking water. We all know how important it is to stay hydrated and to drink water or juice when it's super hot. But are there any guidelines or standards about access to drinking water? The particular question posed is about how if a bathroom, a toilet has got mixer taps, so it's not water coming directly from I don't know what the term is. Sorry, I'm not an expert on plumbing, but the fresh water rather than the tank. Shelley, do you want to go with that one first about the guidelines around drinking water?
Yeah, so the regs that I referred to earlier, health and safety and welfare regulations, make it very clear that there is a duty on employers to provide clean drinking water. They describe it as adequate supply of wholesome drinking water. So presumably that is not a tank water coming from the attic. That is a proper supply of decent drinking water. And in addition to that, when the weather's hot, then providing cool water is a key way of ensuring that you're safe and not dehydrated and able to cool your body temperature. So yeah, absolutely, that is a key demand to be making if it's not already been provided. In the learning resource that we're launching today, there's in the case studies, there's a really interesting one actually of some railway workers who issued a Section 44 notice after the employer refused to provide cool drinking water during a heat wave, and so they actually walked off the job, said it's not safe if we're not going to have access to drinking water, and they shut the station down. It did result in the employer then providing cool drinking water. So you can take any and all means of action to force the employer's hand there, but it is a legal duty, so remind them that the law is on your side there.
Thanks, Shelley. And Jim, one of our viewers, has just posted in the chat as well. It's not just about the water, it's a means to drink it, e.g. cups or a water fountain. I think that's really important. It's not just going to be like a bucket or something. Right. Okay. We've also had a bunch of questions about the balance between keeping somewhere cool, perhaps with fans, and of course, coronavirus. I'm aware we're running out of time, so I am going to direct our viewers to a webinar we did earlier this year about ventilation with regards to airborne infections. So we will include the link to that in our resource list that we'll send out after the webinar. It was a fantastic session talking about the importance of ventilation with regards to any airborne infections, but particular COVID-19 in the workplace. So hopefully that will answer some of the questions we've had about that. Okay, Shelley, I'm really sorry. Another question for you quickly. What about people working at home as either agile or hybrid workers because they don't have a permanent desk in an office anymore? How can we get employers to provide support around temperatures for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, there was a lot of attention on this at the beginning of the COVID pandemic when lots of people were working from home for the first time, and employers were being reminded that they still have a duty of care. They still have to look out for your health and safety wherever you're working from, whether that's your own home or anywhere else. And they should be conducting a risk assessment on that basis as well. I'm hoping that one of our colleagues, Anna, will share a link to the micro learning that we have around working from home and safety that we should expect from employers, but things like providing a fan, things like ensuring that you've got access to clean drinking water. There are things that can and should be demanded from the employer to ensure that you're working safely, and providing you with a thermometer so you can keep track of that as well. And if your home working environment is going above what we would deem to be a maximum working temperature, then it's clearly not an appropriate place for you to be working.
Thanks, Shelley. We've also had a couple of questions about supporting workers who may be having menopausal symptoms, and I am going to also direct you again to our e-learning that we have about the menopause, because it's a huge subject. And I don't think we can do it justice here. We do have some e-learning, and we've had a couple of webinars about the menopause quite a long time ago now, but I still think the information in them is very relevant. So we'll make sure we post links to those as well. Okay, I'm just going to ask, because each of you have mentioned this, just maybe to reference again, because we've had a few questions on section 44. Shelley's already said that the learning that we're launching today does give a few examples of where section 44 has been used and what it might apply to. But I think Sarah and Ian, you've also mentioned it in your presentations. Could you just remind us again what the situation was in the workplaces you referenced that used section 44? That would be really helpful, and hopefully our viewers will be able to see how they could apply it in their situations. Sarah, can we go with you first, please?
Yeah, I'm not aware that it's been used in relation to the sort of high temperatures type situation, but where it was threatened by the NEU was back in January of last year, when schools were brought back at the height of the second wave of COVID, and it was used then to ensure that the next day schools went back online, other than for vulnerable children or children of key workers. So it was kind of used en masse. I'm not sure. I might be wrong. It could have been used in a high temperature situation as well. But
no worries, Sarah. Thank you for that. And as you were speaking, a bunch of links have appeared in the chat that reference section 44 and how it can be used, and some tips for that. Ian, can you remind us, please, about the section 44 action that you mentioned?
We didn't actually use section 44. We just decided that after the incident that happened on our caramel plant, that if the company wasn't prepared to act, then we would, which then obviously led to some emergency meetings taking place between the union and the company, where we agreed a policy about heat. So we didn't actually use section 44, but we would have done it if necessary as a protection. But what was more important was getting the people who worked on there to take action themselves, and then get the management to apply the lessons that actually a death in the workplace brings.
Thanks, Ian. And so even though you said you didn't use section 44 there, just the talking about it led to action from the management off the back of raising it by you and your colleagues. Okay, we have rapidly sped through an hour of, I think, really interesting, considered discussion on this issue. It's obviously a massive thing, and we've had really useful contributions from Ian, from Sarah, and from Shelley on this. We will be sending out all the resources that we've referenced today. It'll either be later today or first thing tomorrow, along with a recording of the webinar. And the final thing from me is to tell you a little bit about an event we've got planned for later this year. So over the past 2.5 years, we at the TUC have really, really enjoyed connecting with you all via a screen. We think we've been able to fill a gap of face-to-face events, and we've been able to do that really successfully. However, we're not going to stop doing that. Of course, we're still going to keep doing webinars, but we also want to have some events where we connect with you face to face and we get to meet you. And we've got one event planned in October. I think it's going to be in the first week of October, but the date might not be 100% confirmed yet. And that's going to be in London. And then we're going to have another event a few weeks later early in the new year. That will be somewhere in the north of England, probably Sheffield, maybe Leeds. So please look out for these when we advertise them. We'd love to meet so many of you at these events. We're going to have lots of speakers talking about what it's like to represent people in the workplace, giving tips and suggestions on the whole range of workplace issues, be that disciplinary, grievances, negotiating around pay, terms and conditions. We're going to get Shelley to do probably more than one workshop about different health and safety things, but not just Shelley. We're going to be hearing from other colleagues about employment law, about equality issues, about union learning, and yeah, whatever else we hear from you, what might be interesting. So please do look out for that. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and have a good rest of the week. We'll see you all soon. Bye bye for now.
Thanks. Stay cool.